Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles, the series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of Grover Cleveland, and the focus is new sheriff in town. The year is 1870, and Grover Cleveland is a practicing attorney in Buffalo, New York. He's doing well. He's highly respected both for his work ethic, his honesty, and all of a sudden people were paying attention to Grover Cleveland, possibly in the political front. Democratic leaders in town approached Cleveland about a job. Would he be willing to run for sheriff of Erie County? Now, why would he want this particular job? This was a rough town in Buffalo. In fact, there were more convicts in the city of Buffalo than any jail across the entire state of New York. The Erie Canal brought lots of opportunity to Buffalo, but it also brought some rough characters. A lot of them were spending time in the county jail. But there was a couple of things that were attractive about the position for Cleveland. Number one, he was interested in public service. And sometimes the hardest job to get in the public service to get elected to is the first one. And this was elective office. If he could win that here, maybe it would open up some opportunities down the road. Number two, it was a lucrative position because not only would he get his own salary, there were extensive fees that he could earn in addition to his salary. Take home could be around $13,000 in a single year. That was enough to send a lot of money home to his family, to his mother, as well as build a nest egg by himself. And so for these two reasons, principally, he agreed to run for sheriff. Now, it was a pretty quiet campaign. He only gave 5 speeches to pursue his own cause, but in the end, Grover Cleveland was elected sheriff of Erie County by a margin of about 300 votes. He began his political life not just as a status quo politician to kind of keep things going as they were. He was a reformer, and he was going to be a reformer really throughout his political career, particularly with an eye on the public purse. He thought the fix was in and corruption was a part of the giving out of contracts in the city of Buffalo, and for what he was responsible for as sheriff, he was going to take a different approach. This pay-to-play concept was anathema to him. He was not going to be a party to it. In fact, he was going to try to clean it up and get more value for taxpayer dollars. He also wasn't going to shirk any responsibilities that came with the job, including that of executioner. There was a clause in his agreement that the sheriff, who was technically responsible for literally pulling the cord when it came to sending a man to his death on the gallows, he could pass that responsibility to someone else if he was willing to pay them $10. Well, he was not willing to do that because that he felt was his responsibility. And there were 2 executions on his watch, and in both cases, he did pull that cord to send the man to his death, but he also tried to do it with some dignity for the convict. There was a lot of clamoring at the time for public executions. People wanted to see these hangings, but not for Grover Cleveland. He decided to do the 2 executions he did behind the walls of the jail. There would be no public execution. And again, he took the responsibility himself to pull that cord both times. After 3 years as sheriff, he said, you know what, mission accomplished for now. I'm not going to run for re-election. His reputation had been well enhanced by the work that he did and the reforms that he pursued, but time to go back to his own private law practice. And for this, he signed up with a couple of partners, a former congressman by the name of Lyman and a former clerk of his, Shan Bissell, called Shan Bissell throughout his life, and actually Bissell would become one of Cleveland's very close friends. And the pattern would continue for Grover Cleveland. Just before in the law firm, he was the hardest man in the office day by day. As Bissell noted, Cleveland was generally the first one in the office in the morning, the last one out at night. And all the hours of these long days were devoted with patience and zeal to the work he found before him. He was earnest and hardworking during the day, but he was out most nights having fun as well. Out with the boys, with Bissell, with his former law partner, Oscar Folsom. They would go to the saloons at night. They would go hunting and fishing on the weekends. What about female companionship? Well, nothing too serious for Grover Cleveland. In fact, his sisters were wondering, he's now in his early 30s. You ever planning to get married? You ever think about that? And at one point, Cleveland responded to them, he thinks about it a good many times. And the more I think of it, the more I think I'll not do it. Well, in fact, Grover Cleveland would get married, but not for more than a decade in the future when he was president of the United States. There were some tragedies around these times in the 1870s for Cleveland. He lost both of his brothers, Fred and Cecil, the two who had signed up and fought so valiantly in the Civil War. They were on a ship, on a business trip. The ship went down off the coast of Florida. That tragic loss, coupled by the loss of Oscar Folsom, who again was one of Cleveland's closest friends, died in a carriage accident, just suddenly lost, hitting him very hard. And in this case, Cleveland wanted to help out. He had known Folsom's widow, Emma, for years, as well as their 11-year-old daughter, who's named Frank, mostly called Frances, a more feminine name, although her birth name was Frank. He actually became her guardian for a period of time as he helped care for the widow and the family of Oscar Folsom. Hard to believe that this 11-year-old girl would actually be the answer to Grover Cleveland's sister's question about marriage. This is the woman he would marry a decade in the future as President of the United States. Hard to imagine, though, at this time. We'll cover that in a future episode. Well, it wasn't just his work ethic that caught people's attention. It was also Grover Cleveland's sense of honor, which again came from his religious upbringing from his father, the preacher, the moral qualities of religion, right and wrong. If he didn't believe in a case, he wouldn't take it. And he was honorable in his pursuit in the courtroom. So says George Clinton, who happened to be the chief judge of the Superior Court of New York. According to Clinton, so keen was his Cleveland sense of honor and justice that it would have been against the grain of his character to have tried to mislead a jury if justice was opposed to him. I certainly never knew him to make that effort. He had well-earned reputation. People were noticing Grover Cleveland, and it was a time juxtaposed a period of corruption in the United States. This was the period of Ulysses Grant's second term, and his cabinet, but frankly, the most corrupt probably in American history, with all kinds of charges of malfeasance and bribery. The fix was in. Reformers were starting to take notice, looking for people like a Grover Cleveland. Maybe there are some honest politicians out there that can kind of change this system and bring reform. And so Cleveland was approached in 1881 to run for mayor of Buffalo. Now, the Democrats were really pushing for this. Again, initially wasn't very interested because it was such a reputation for sort of corrupt politics at the city level. But the Democrats set their eyes on Cleveland, and they actually nominated him in their convention and approved that nomination without really even telling him. They went and found him afterwards. He was actually in court at the time. They said, "Look, we just nominated you for mayor. Will you run?" Well, Cleveland thought about it, and he eventually said yes, but he actually had a condition. If he was really going to be able to clean things up, he wanted to start with this election. The number 2 man on the Democratic ticket for the positions on this race was for the position of city comptroller, and it was one of the political bosses of the Democratic Party, John Sheehan, who was up for that position. And Cleveland put a line in the sand and said no. If you're going to put Sheehan in there, then clearly you're not serious about reform. Take him out, and I'll be your man to run for mayor. So the Democratic leaders went off, they thought about it, and you said, you know what, we want reform, we want Grover Cleveland, Sheehan is out, and Cleveland was put in to run for mayor. And not only did he win, he won big, 57% of the vote. Not only did the Democrats support him, but a lot of the reform-minded Republicans also jumped on the bandwagon for the honest, hard worker Grover Cleveland. They thought he was the answer the city would need. This was also going to be an uphill battle. The city was basically run by 26 aldermen, the town council, where there were 2 each from the 13 wards in the city. Now, there were only 10 of them that were really committed to reform, so they couldn't push through a majority on the legislation coming from the town council. But those 10 were really important because if Grover Cleveland wanted to veto something, they were able to sustain the veto with their 10 votes. So this would be really important in the administration of the mayor, Grover Cleveland. Now, he opened up with his inaugural address telling the people that he was serious, what he had in mind, that the affairs of the city should be conducted as far as possible upon the same principles as a good businessman manages his private concerns. He was going to look out for the public purse, and he was going to work hard at it, and he was going to use that veto pen, frankly, whenever he thought something was gone awry, whether it was bad legislation or sometimes, frankly, even just poorly worded legislation. He wasn't going to tolerate it as the reform mayor. In fact, the first bill that came to his desk was to establish a city morgue. Now, this was a reasonable concept. He vetoed it anyway. Why? He thought the language in the bill was too vague. It was ripe for corruption, too many loopholes. He sent it back several times before the aldermen finally got it right, And then he approved the new city morgue. This was his view of the world. He would be the final check on every expenditure in the city of Buffalo, protecting the public purse, and even for noble causes. If he didn't feel it was appropriate for taxpayer dollars, he would turn it down. One case in point, the alderman approved a $500, essentially a donation to the Firemen's Benevolent Organization. Nope, not approved by Veto Mayor Grover Cleveland because he thought that was an inappropriate use of taxpayer money. He really set his sights on sole source contracts and earmarks from the aldermen because he knew, frankly, this is where the fix was really in. And he's got 250,000 citizens now that he was responsible for, and he was going to look out for every penny. The big showdown came on a 5-year contract to clean the streets of Buffalo. The aldermen were favoring a bid from George Talbot, $422,000 over the 5 years, which happened to be $100,000 more than the next bid. Why were the aldermen going in that direction? Because $50,000 of those dollars were basically kickbacks to the aldermen to get their vote. Grover Cleveland said no. In his veto message, he said, "This is a time for plain speech, and my objection to the action of your honorable body now under consideration shall be plainly stated. I withhold my assent from the same because I regard it as the culmination of a most barefaced, impudent, and shameless scheme to betray the interests of the people and to worse than squander the public money." He would force them through his veto to rework that deal, send it back, look at other suppliers, and in fact, when they finally awarded that contract, he saved the county $100,000, removed the stain of corruption, and again, people were noticing the reform Veto Mayor in Buffalo. There were individual cases that caught Cleveland's attention as well. Again, this sense of morality, right and wrong. That touched on the case of Martin Flanagan. Flanagan was an employee at a Buffalo grain elevator where he was convicted of murdering his foreman, John Cairns, and he was only days away from execution. Where Cleveland got an appeal to look into the case. And when he does these things, he dives right in at the detail level. He talked to the judge in the case. He looked at the evidence. He went and met with Flanagan in prison, and he was convinced that there were extenuating circumstances and the death penalty was not warranted for Martin Flanagan. But what could he do? He appealed to the governor of the state. That was the last chance. Alonzo Cornell. Now, an appeal had already gone to Cornell on behalf of Flanagan, and he turned it down. But Cleveland now took this up himself, and at least Cornell gave him a 3-week stay to come to Albany to make his case. And so that's what happened. They got the 3-week stay on the execution, and Cleveland led a large contingent into the governor's mansion, into the governor's office, where they spent about 2 hours with Governor Cornell trying to convince him to take the death penalty off the table. Well, after 2 hours, the governor was getting weary. He was not convinced. He was about to end the whole thing. He stood up, and as he did, Grover Cleveland stood up as well and got more emphatic. According to attorney Edward Hatch, who was there, he quoted Cleveland as saying, "We come to you as the king pleading for mercy. It is your duty to hear us and hear us to the end." Hatch continued his description. Now, here were two men, both very large physically, both determined in character and in habit. Both had been used to the exercise of command in the spheres in which they had moved. Both were powerful in will. The whole chamber was hushed. Gradually, the governor let his hand fall, resumed his seat in the chair, and Mr. Cleveland proceeded. He, Cornell, realized that for once he had met his master, and Grover Cleveland did continue for about another 15 or 20 minutes. They then took a brief recess, and Cornell made his decision. Death penalty was indeed off the table. That would not be the punishment for Flanagan. He would stay in prison, but he would not be executed. And this was due really solely to the earnest hard work of the caring Grover Cleveland. Now, Grover Cleveland would be back in this office in the not too distant future, the governor's office in Albany, but it would be under very different circumstances. Again, people were noticing Grover Cleveland, the honest reformer. They were pushing him to run for governor. But that is the story for another day. That's Grover Cleveland and the new sheriff in town from the life of Grover Cleveland. For more presidential chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher and this is Presidential Chronicles.